Welcome to the Hello Someday podcast, the podcast for busy women who are ready to drink less and live more. I'm Casey McGuire Davidson, ex-red wine girl turned life coach, helping women create lives they love without alcohol. But it wasn't that long ago that I was anxious, overwhelmed, and drinking a bottle of wine a night to unwind. I thought that wine was the glue holding my life together, helping me cope with my kids, my stressful job, and my busy life. I didn't realize that my love affair with drinking was making me more anxious and less able to manage my responsibilities. In this podcast, my goal is to teach you the tried and true secrets of creating and living a life you don't want to escape from. Each week, I'll bring you tools, lessons, and conversations to help you drink less and live more. I'll teach you how to navigate our drinking-obsessed culture without a buzz, how to sit with your emotions when you're lonely or angry, frustrated or overwhelmed, how to self-soothe without a drink, and how to turn the decision to stop drinking from your worst-case scenario to the best decision of your life. I am so glad you're here. Now let's get started. Well, hi there. I'm really excited for the topic we're diving into today because I'm bringing on a guest for an in-depth conversation about how understanding yourself, your sensitivities, and your preferences can help you be kinder to yourself, have more confidence in your strengths, and understand why in certain situations and environments and relationships you can feel uncertain and uncomfortable and how to adjust for them. I just started doing this work a few months ago, and I wish that I had this information years ago, both when I was drinking and pushing down anxiety about what I was experiencing at work and in early sobriety to help me navigate the world when I was feeling like I was walking around with all my nerves exposed and without my outer layer of skin. Gaining perspective will help you navigate your daily life without feeling like you need the numbing protection of alcohol to shut down your brain at the end of the day and to push down your anxiety and to relax. My guest today is Kate. We met 3 years ago at an incredible yoga retreat on Salt Spring Island in British Columbia. I went to the retreat when I had been sober about a year and a half, and I was amazed at how being surrounded by women on the same path, talking and sharing and doing yoga in the morning and the afternoon. I slept in a yurt and we ate incredible organic farm meals 3 times a day. It all brought back joy I hadn't felt in years. I'll share the links to the retreats. They're put on by She Recovers in the show notes of this episode. I've attended 2 retreats in Salt Spring Island, and I'm really excited to go to my first one in Mexico in February of 2021. Kate and I connected immediately at this retreat, and she's not only a wonderful human being, but is also certified to administer and interpret the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator Assessment and is trained in Dare to Lead by Brene Brown, which helps women step out with greater courage in any area of their lives. So let's dive in. Kate, welcome to the Hello Someday podcast. I am so glad you're here.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Casey. It's a really exciting opportunity to talk about something that I think can make such a difference in people's lives. And I remember meeting you so clearly at that retreat on Salt Spring. And you're right, we did connect immediately. I'm also excited to hear that you are headed to Mexico in February 2021. I might need to check my calendar. It'd be nice to go on another retreat.
Yeah, I'm going with a good friend of mine, Ingrid, who I know you're with as well. It's on our bucket list for a couple years now. Kate, I'm really excited about this conversation. And to start, I'd love to hear a little bit about your decision to stop drinking and how you came to that.
Well, and you're right, Casey. I remember meeting you very distinctly at the retreat on Salt Spring Island in 2017. And that retreat, I believe it was my second retreat with She Recovers. The first one that I went to was in May 2016 in Mexico. And I was there. I was really drawn to going to the retreat. Interestingly, not to do with any substance use, not to do with alcohol. I was knee deep in workaholism. I had separated from my partner, headed towards divorce. And I remember booking it actually on New Year's Eve, 2015, just saying, I need something wellness oriented. My life was in all kinds of, I think chaos might have been, probably wouldn't be too strong of a word. And then when I got to the retreat, I remember one of the things that I thought of the week before was, the thought of going to a retreat on the beach in Mexico and not drinking. I mean, who does that, right?
I know, right?
I remember thinking, well, this is part of the wellness and there's going to be yoga. And so when I would tell friends or colleagues of mine, I would say that it was kind of like, well, it's like a really, it's a wellness oriented and, how could you not have, margaritas and they're going to get, giving me a hard time about it. And to be honest, I was struggling with it because I associated having a good time with drinking and vice versa. And so I thought, ooh, boy, did I do the right thing? I mean, I booked this 5 months ago, but I went and it was absolutely transformative. Most of the women there, I would say, were on the path of sobriety and questioning the role of alcohol or substance use in their lives, amongst other things. And I remember having a conversation with Jean McCarthy, who's there from the Bubble Hour.
Yeah, she's the host of the Bubble Hour. I
right
for those episodes, and I think you were too.
I did. And she's lovely. I really connected with her. She's a fellow Canadian. She's from Alberta. And as I was listening to some of the stories, some of the women kind of sharing around kind of signals or signs of how they knew that alcohol was not a healthy part of their lives, it was like listening, it was like a mirror to my own life.
Mm-hmm.
And yet I hadn't been drawn to that retreat to think about the role of alcohol in my life. But it was front and center in my mind. Behaviors like hiding your drinking or, topping up a glass, but not really letting anybody know. It's like, oh, this is my first glass, but it's actually your third.
Yes.
And people even as close as like your partner, kind of not being honest with them about your drinking. And I kind of thought, well, I do that. And I'm thinking, but, and it kind of helped me tap into some of the feelings intuitively saying, yeah, I know that's not good. But to be honest, it was not the primary thing for me that was in front of me as an issue in my life at the moment. So,
yeah.
But it really got, and most importantly, perhaps, I had a fantastic time.
Yes.
No drinking for a week. After the second day, didn't even think of it. So it really, all of these myths around how do you have fun without drinking, right? How do you have a gathering of people without a cooler of beers? And, it was in my adult life, easily a couple of decades since something like that had happened.
And I tell the people I work with in coaching all the time, I'm like, have you ever tried to see whether that is incredibly fun because of drinking or whether you just have always happened to drink during that thing, which is incredibly fun. And most of us never attempt to do these things. Like you were saying, a Mexican beach for a week without drinking. So it's really hard to separate whether your life is fun because of drinking or you just happen to drink.
Exactly. We just have such a strong association with it culturally and otherwise that, to make a break from that isn't something that we do unless there's quote unquote like a problem. But, so that was kind of the early path for me that I would say. But one of the reasons that I think it's really fitting and appropriate to talk about the Myers-Briggs type indicator and in the context of the work that and coaching that you do, Casey, is that it's reflecting on and being more self-aware around the role that alcohol plays in our lives. Usually means that there's some kind of introspection going on. There's some kind of reflection about, it's a check-in. It's like, what is going on? What's going on with my marriage, my relationships, my engagement at work, my kids? And when you're getting a better sense of self-understanding about, like, what makes you, what are some of the tools that can help you along the way? And as a practitioner of the MBTI, I see it as one tool. It's really neutral information to help understand what your unique preferences are in the world. And you mentioned that at the beginning. I've done lots of individual and group and workplace interpretations over the years. And I think it's really important right from the outset to make really clear that, this is not about pigeonholing people. So for example, you could have someone who's an ENFP learn that their coworker also has an ENFP preference. But there's lots of things about them that are very different as individuals. But they might also learn about what some of those commonalities are, which is part of the learning process and being able to use the MBTI for those purposes. But again, we're all unique individuals, and the MBTI is a tool to assess and understand what some of our unique gifts are and learn about others, and use it as the ability to, the way that I kind of explain it is, when you're in this process of, and use the analogy of peeling back the onion about who we are, particularly around midlife, there's a concept of nature and nurture, right? So how much of who we are at age, example, 40, is who we were when we were a 5-year-old. It's really our essence versus what we've developed over time by external influences. Could be our parents, could be society, could be, some of us are people pleasers. If we have the ability, a tendency, towards codependency, you might ask, so what's me and what's the influence of the world as a whole? And I'm not saying that necessarily doing the Myers-Briggs is going to, because it's something you fill out yourself. So you're still providing that information, but I think it's a way to explore that and reflect on what your unique preferences are.
I think that's so true. And I loved when you said the word essence, because that really resonated with me. And since I've stopped drinking, obviously, and even before I was on, maybe it's midlife, maybe it's something else, this path of self-discovery. And one of the things I see is I was internalizing the values of my parents, what they thought were, gold star behaviors I should be. And after doing some work, I realized that I was overcompensating and sort of trying to fit a square peg in a round hole because my parents thought the square peg was the best. Does that make sense?
It absolutely does. And it reminds me of a conversation that you and I had recently. And maybe I'll talk a bit about it now. When we look and say, what is something that I've been doing and how I've been, making choices in my life or living in a certain way because I know that I get external validation from it versus is it really who I am?
Yes.
Is the power of and the influence of extroverts in our world. And I think that introverts really get a bad rap because there, it's associated with like, being shy or inhibited, and perhaps even like, bookish, and that extroverts are really where the action is. And it's important in the context of the Myers-Briggs type assessment to kind of make sure we break down some of those misunderstandings, because that's not what extroversion and introversion mean in the context of the MBTI. But also, I think it's that particular dichotomy is a place to really look at how introverts bring some unique gifts to the world. And we know that one of the things, you look at the leadership literature, Brené Brown talks about it very much in her latest book, Dare to Lead, is the power of asking questions and listening. And introverts, that's one of their strengths, is listening and processing and taking time. If you have an introvert in the workplace or in your family and they speak up, it's very likely that they have thought about what they're going to say before they say it. And for extroverts, they might think, what a concept. I'm kind of thinking as I'm going along. Can you follow me? And maybe what I said 30 seconds ago, let me change that. And so, both preferences are important in terms of bringing kind of their unique gifts to the workplace, but to the world. But there's a book that I'll mention now for any of your listeners, Casey, who are introverts or live with introverts or have children who are introverts. And it was published in 2012. It's a researcher. Her name is Susan Cain, Cain, and it's called Quiet: The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking. And as we kind of go through, we'll talk a bit more about MBTI in a moment. But if there is any kind of, intersection or the concept of introversion kind of comes out in terms of you understanding your type or the types of the people around you. I've read the book. It was actually a book club pick several years ago in my book club. I'm part of a nonfiction book club. And it was probably one of the best discussions we've ever had.
And one thing I find with, for example, some of the women I'm coaching, and I think it was in myself too, when you go to events where you aren't as comfortable, maybe it's a work happy hour, maybe it's a company party, maybe it's a school PTA event with a bunch of other parents, a lot of people feel that drinking makes the interaction more easy. It helps make them more extroverted. And I think you're going to talk about that. That's a misconception of what extroversion is, but it's a crutch that a lot of us think that we need to behave in the way that we think we should, to be the life of the party, to keep conversations going, to get rid of some of that awkwardness that we all feel. And one of the things I talk about with my clients is go to an event that you typically would drink at and actually ask questions, observe what's going around you, have deeper conversations, and you might actually figure out that it's more fun. I mean, you'll certainly leave without a hangover and remember all the conversations you have. It's a plus as well, but you certainly are more present and you don't realize how absent you are when you're focused on drinking. So that idea of I need to drink to be an extrovert and to present myself in the best way at events, one, that version of extroversion may not be the correct one. That definition may be off, which I think you taught me, but also it's not necessarily that drinking and being the life of the party is presenting your best self.
I think all true on that, Casey. So, yeah.
I noticed a little bit, when I'm pretty, somewhat new to the Myers-Briggs, and you mentioned earlier a bunch of 4-letter acronyms that I'm guessing that the people listening to this, because I didn't, may not know what an ENFJ is versus an INT, whatever, right? So
that sounds great. Let's jump into
explain a little bit about
that. So the MBTI, the Myers-Briggs Type Assessment Indicator. So the MBTI, the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, is based on the theories of Carl Jung. It was created in the 1950s by a research team. There's a bit of history if anybody is interested in looking back on that. But it looks at personality preferences in 4 different dichotomies. And that kind of, we'll jump into what that looks like. There's 4 different dichotomies. And the first one, extroversion or introversion. And what that's about in the theory of Myers-Briggs, it's about where you draw energy from and what you pay attention to. And the next dichotomy, it's sensing or intuition. And what that focuses on is that how do you take in information in the world around you? The third one is thinking or feeling, and that's really focused on how you make decisions. And the fourth dichotomy, the judging or perceiving, is how, as an individual, how you deal with the outside world. Now, when you hear those 4-letter combinations, that's because there's 16 possible combinations of the Myers-Briggs, and they're called types. And there's also a lot of dynamic interactions between the types. There's like a dominant function, auxiliary function. I'm not going to get into a whole lot about that today. But, I think it might be, a way for listeners to understand this and kind of get a sense of it is, well, let's talk about a couple of examples. Okay. So, the Myers-Briggs can be used in a lot of different settings in terms of like teamwork, to understand what your coworkers' strengths and preferences are, in relationships, and gosh, I'm thinking of different environments. Yeah, teamwork, people who are on a kind of a career development, re-exploration track, is to kind of go back and say, I'm really rethinking a career process, decisions about what kind of occupation. And the Myers-Briggs can be really helpful there.
Yeah, I actually really want my husband to take it now that I'm kind of diving into it. We've been married for 18 years and I know him, and there's certainly parts of him that are wonderful, and I so appreciate it. And other parts that, I realized with myself that I'm very uncomfortable with I really love harmony in all ways, and I'm sensitive to negative emotions, even if they're not directed at me, just if they're in my same space. And I've always tried to make him accommodate my sensitivities. And I think it might help me to intellectually understand him better.
With previous partners, I've always, perhaps not in the first few weeks, I've always done the Myers-Briggs with them. I know.
That is funny. Yeah. I'm sure they love that. They're like, okay, let me assess your personality.
Now I can kind of figure it out, without them actually doing the online indicator, or old school from years ago, it was a paper indicator. But if you don't mind, Casey, let's jump in. I want to kind of hone in on that example that you said around,
absolutely,
really wanting harmony. And, your Myers-Briggs type, the ENFJ, extroverted, intuitive, feeling, and judging, that NF combination, and it appears in 4 of the 16 types, is what it's called as the idealists. And, really focused on, so for the ENFJ, it's so interesting, given, the work that you're doing and the gifts that you have that you're bringing to the world. It's a big theme for the ENFJ is mentoring, tapping into and seeing the potential of people, and helping people become more of who they are, using your communication skills, warmth. What are the ideals? So again, idealists, right? So looking at what are the ideals and how can we be closer to what our ideals are, bringing out the best in others. And there's lots of gifts. And then there's always things from, based on our preference, where what's called based on Jung, it's kind of a shadow. So what are the areas that we might not be paying attention to? Or what are the areas that bring us out of preference? And conflict, right? Something, NFs and conflict, it's a bit of a tough one, because the need and the wish for harmony really requires conflict to be openly acknowledged and addressed. I'm going to throw a bit of a different lens on this versus some of the Myers-Briggs types, and I'll put mine out there as an example, the ENTJ.
Yeah.
So that NT, the intuitive, sensing, thinking, and feeling, so that NT combination of those two dichotomies, you better be prepared. If you're an ENFJ, or if you have any NF combination, maybe you're an INFP, and you're doing a presentation, say, for your team at work, and you've got NTs on your team, make room for debate. Make room for being challenged.
Which can feel like conflict.
But it's not. And that's the power of understanding preferences. Because if you perceive someone saying, hold on, I want to go back to that slide. What do you mean when you said this? What evidence do you have to back that up? An NT, what's fundamental to that type is rational, evidence-based. Help me understand this. I need to understand, what is some of the evidence. They're very, very structurally, there's a structure, there's a path. And also, as opposed to an ST, an NT wants to understand the big picture. So the questions that the NT is asking isn't so much questioning you on your facts. It's help me understand what you said so I can get the overall message of what you're saying as an NF, as an idealist. So, and that kind of dynamic from a preference perspective, the NF, the idealists, the NTs, the rationals, guardians, the SJs, very focused on between the S sensing and intuitive dichotomy, very focused on facts, and the J is kind of wanting structure. So SJs are really important because they play such an important role in the world, overseers, supervisors, protectors. You think about law enforcement or accountants. You need people who have generally those preferences.
I think it's funny that you put accountants and law enforcement in the same category. I would never think that those personality preferences would be one similar.
When studies are done, and this is one of the things that's really one of the strengths of the MBTIs as a tool, as a preference indicator, is that there's been longitudinal studies and to validate the instrument, and they've done studies to look at what the overall distribution of occupations are by the 16 types. And again, I'll go back to my caveat that absolutely everybody brings their individual history, their individual influence, their cultural background, their gender perspective, whatever their life experience is. And I think that's really important, to provide that context. But the research does show is that according to type and preference in this assessment, that occupations do fall into some of the common quadrants. And the SJ, the guardians, tend to be those who very much are focusing on, for that S preference, just the facts, please. What, where, when, why, and how. And I need to know that. And so the other preference type on that dichotomy is the intuitives. So what they might say is, okay, I can see it all now. I get the big picture. Future-oriented, looking at possibilities, getting the big picture. An example around the sensing types and intuitive types, use an example here when it comes to communication. If you think in the workplace, I was involved in a project at one point where it was a large 900-person organization where our employee intranet needed to be redone. And being kind of the senior leader who was accountable for that, my role was looking at, quality time, making sure it met user needs, budget, all of those kind of things. And I had a vision for what some of the improvements could be for that intranet. Was I the right person to really get involved in 2-hour meetings going through the information architecture? No, right? Not only because the role I had in the organization, but the kind of meetings and engagement that I would have with the team was very much, at that kind of vision level, and trusting and making sure the people around you, that you've got someone who has that sensing type preference, to go through and understand all of the details and ask all the questions and make sure you're asking users everything you need to know, to build that. Yeah, in terms of the S and the N dichotomy, I think that's perhaps an explanation of that.
Quick question for you. I know a lot of the women that listen to this may identify as people pleasers or overachievers. That's kind of two areas that I hear a lot about. The idea being like they have overflowing to-do lists. They have a lot of responsibilities. They're super busy. They're trying to exceed in every area of their life, whether it's work or home. And they're really feeling overwhelmed by it all, or like it's unsustainable. Is there a personality type, or can you tell me the different personality types and how that may contribute or support or cause tension with that sort of? I feel like so many of us are in that place right now. And when I was doing that, I keep looking around and saying, how come everyone else can cope with this, whereas I can't? And I'm sure all of that was internal and people on the outside couldn't see. And yet I felt like I was breaking to some extent. And let's be clear, drinking a bottle of wine and I did not help that situation. But just curious about the Myers-Briggs and how it may or may not help or not help that sort of building your schedule to overwhelm.
I think the most important value out of doing an assessment such as the Myers-Briggs type indicator is to figure out what are some of the preferences that you have as an individual. When you find out, okay, let's say that you do the assessment and your type comes out as, let's say, an ISFJ. So you have an intuitive preference, sensing, feeling preference, and judging. And once you know whatever those types represent, once you know that, and you are able to take that and reflect on what are the areas of your life where you may be operating out of preference. Because when you operate out of preference, it's energy, there's exhaustion. And none of us in this world have the ability to say, okay, I did my Myers-Briggs and I'm going to live my type. And my job has to be 100%, and my family, like I want to be in preference 100% of the time. It's not going to happen. But if you are peeling back the onion, learning about yourself, making some changes and some shifts to say, I want to show up in the world and be authentic. And I want to not go to work as only a means to a paycheck. If you do that, and you see that the role that you have is a mismatch in whatever balance doesn't work for you, you've learned something, right? So if you learn that being in sales And being in sales with a growing quota or the performance bonus percentage is really where the majority of the compensation will come from. If you are an introvert, and again, it doesn't mean that you can't do sales, but an introvert will thrive in a sales environment through building one-on-one relationships. If the way that you do sales in your organization is constant presentations and networking and ways that might be draining your energy, you get to make a decision and say, okay, that's what might not be fitting for me. And you don't make a shift based on anything that a website or a piece of paper says. The assessment needs to really resonate with you. It's a tool that you say, okay, that makes sense. That's what it is. Let's focus on the ISFJ again. This is a person who wants to know the facts, who, what, where, when, and how, and needs to be really grounded. Like if there's a presentation or a team meeting and it's like, what do we need to do by when and what's expected? And you have a supervisor who's telling you about the latest management brainstorm session and it doesn't get down to a level where you can understand what does it mean for you. And that's where what it means is it doesn't mean that your supervisor or manager doesn't appreciate the details. It doesn't mean that they aren't accountable and appreciative of the work of the team. What it means is that they have a different preference. And so it's appreciating and having a dialogue that's respective of that, to know that. When you think about the difference between if there's a thinking and feeling preference, and again, I'm going to use a workplace example because that's what I'm most familiar with. From a communication point of view, those and I'll go with kind of the NF, an intuitive feeler, an intuitive thinker. Use those two preferences. Someone who's got the NF preference is really because they are those idealists and they're very much focused on looking at the impact of decisions in the workplace and when thinking about people. As an individual, you're also going to be looking for feedback as a person. And it's not going to be just every 2 weeks at your biweekly or quarterly or once a year at your performance review. And for NFs, that feedback is a powerful motivator. And it's huge. It's powerful stuff.
That's 100%. That's me. Like I had a boss who was super cut and dry, who didn't give a lot of positive feedback, who didn't give a lot of reactions at all in any way. And it was extremely unsatisfying for me. And I had a boss previously, exact same role, exact same job, who had a different style. And I was extremely motivated. I think it would have helped me to know that it wasn't me or it wasn't her. It was just her style. And I did not have that understanding. I felt like she didn't value me when it wasn't necessarily that. It was just that because of my preference, yes. I didn't feel
millions valued. Of NFs are with you on that, Casey. And one of the strategies in that situation, and one of the strategies that I'm aware of that's been used effectively in that situation is if your supervisor is an NT, the times where you may get feedback from them is related to corrections or clarifications or feedback that's can you
yes.
I noticed X, can you revise this? Can you take another look at it? So they're clearly engaged and knowing what's going on with your portfolio and your accountabilities, but the time that they might be in touch relates to what's seen as, oh great, I hear from my boss when it's something that isn't positive.
Or I did 17 things right, and all I hear about is the 3 things.
And, for some folks, this can be the family meeting or a date night, or, explicitly saying things like gratitude exercises, right? Things that if you're an NT and you find like you are focusing on your deficiencies and the deficiencies around you and things that are wrong, it's like we need to understand our type and what are some of the strategies that can bring us into better self-awareness and bring us into a place where we are more balanced and paying attention to the things.
And what I liked earlier that you said is that it's understanding yourself to empower you to get what you need. And I think a lot of times when we're drinking, we aren't able to communicate clearly enough to get what we need, or we blame ourselves because we drink too much and then we're hungover and we're overcompensating and self-sabotaging. So you're in that cycle and you don't realize that, hey, regardless of that, or maybe that's a symptom of not getting what I need. And part of that is because I'm not communicating it, or I'm not even aware. I'm beating myself up because I feel this way, but I feel this way for a reason. And there's nothing wrong. I always say, like, there are no bad emotions. Any negative emotion is simply a signal that you're not getting what you need.
Right. That's right.
So, Kate, I know we've gone into a bunch of examples and situations of different personality types and how they may affect your interactions and your self-perceptions as you navigate the world. But can we come up a level and just give the listeners sort of a broad picture view of the Myers-Briggs and what you should know about it?
Absolutely. And I would say that there's three things, Casey. The first thing I'd say is, as an assessment, the Myers-Briggs is a tool to help you get to know yourself. So what makes you you? What makes you tick? What makes you unique? And this is a time where, we may be going through a lot of reflection and assessment and looking back and looking forward. And it's an opportunity to check in, get out of your head a little bit, and have something that's a really well-researched, validated tool to give you some information and learn about yourself. The second thing is, how can you use that information to understand and appreciate others? That can be your family, it's the workplace, it can be it can be anyone. But when you understand yourself better, it helps you understand and appreciate others as well. And what the Myers-Briggs does is it shows what your gifts and your preferences are. And even if the people in your family don't also do the assessment, chances are you might have a sense and say, wow, if I've got that really strong need for the deadline and everything that we do, can we please put it on the family calendar? And why won't people listen to me? It's not because they don't want to. Yes. It's because they're like, well, it might change. I don't know what's going to happen Saturday. That's why I didn't write it on there. Okay. So it's like, oh, they don't, maybe your partner doesn't feel the need. It's like, let's just keep it open. I didn't RSVP yet because I wasn't sure. So you understand, right?
Yeah. And you could be like, why doesn't he value me? Why can't he support me in what I need? And the truth is,
exactly,
he's operating out of his own preferences and is wondering why you're trying to nail him down. It's just a different preference, which when you're in it feels personal.
And I think that's actually an excellent point, Casey, is that, the assessment, the MBTI type allows you to see kind of what your unique preferences are, that you're doing, because that's kind of your operating system, right? And your partner, and he might have a different operating system. Now, having said that, to understand and appreciate others and to live, under the same roof, sometimes means that we do need to work on a preference. So it might mean that when there's an agreement that people are going to put stuff on the family calendar, even though that might not be the first thing that comes to mind for them, that they do it. And also when something gets missed, that there's some flexibility and some leeway.
Yeah. Yeah.
The third thing that I think is really powerful about the MBTI assessment is that those insights that you've gained from getting to know yourself, to understand and appreciate others, it's take those insights and what can you do to put them into action. So you've learned, you've got that knowledge, but that's really just the beginning. So what can you do about it? And, as I mentioned, the MBTI is used for people who are doing kind of career exploration. It's applied in the workplace around teams and conflict. But there's so many ways, what can you do with that information? And it may be that you want to do the MBTI because you've always heard about it or you did a, online assessment, 5 years ago, and you're just curious to see where things are at. You don't have to necessarily turn it into action. But depending on what your objectives are, and again, peeling back that onion around self-awareness and to see at a time of change in your life, when you're making changes that are, focused on just making the shift to feel more authentic, to change behaviors that have become routine, but you just know aren't working for you. And that's where, for me, alcohol is not a part of my life because I made the choice that it just didn't work for me. I'm not sure for me necessarily the Myers-Briggs was part of that, but self-learning and self-assessment was. Those are the three things I'd say. Get to know yourself, understand and appreciate others. And then with that knowledge that you've learned, how are you going to put it into action if you feel like it, if that's what works for you?
And I think it just helps women who are often so hard on themselves and have such a strong inner critic voice, give themselves more grace and forgive themselves for not measuring up to what their parents have told them they should be, or what the workplace values, or what their boss is telling them to be, or maybe a partner who says, why are you so sensitive? Just understanding who you are helps you navigate the world, give yourself a little more self-awareness and understanding, and focus on what your strengths are. Because I feel like you mentioned the shadow. All we deal with is the shadow. All we think about ourselves is the shadow and not the benefits of the way we function in the world. So I think that's really helpful. Kate, I think those three things that people should know about the Myers-Briggs and how it can apply to their life and the ways it can contribute are really important. And I'm glad you summarized it so clearly because I have trouble doing that. But if women listening to this want to dig a little deeper, want to understand what their type is, what their preferences are, and how to apply it to their lives, do you have a couple of resources that you think would be helpful to refer these women to? And I will also, of course, put anything you mentioned in the show notes for our listeners so they can access that.
Yeah, there are some good online resources. The way that MBTI works as a company is that they train and certify people such as myself across the world, actually. But particularly there's two companies, they're different companies, one in the US, one in Canada. But there's good online resources that are what I'd call as kind of reasonable approximations. And officially, I'm not really supposed to actually say this, but I will. One of the websites, it's idrlabs.com, and they have an online self-assessment that I have used before. It approximates the MBTI test. And so that's I think, if you want to give it a go, take a look, do the assessment. And then there are resources on, I think it's actually the Myers-Briggs.com is the US company that's does certifications and training. there's so much MBTI on the internet, so much MBTI information on the internet. It's really a bit of a crapshoot. So I would say idrlabs.com and then the Myers-Briggs.com to get some more official information.
Great. And I know you are also able to do the assessment.
I do. So I'm certified in Canada through a company called Psychometrics Canada. And the way that I work with clients is doing an online assessment. And then normally especially now in the world of COVID-19, doing Zoom or FaceTime interpretation meetings. So what I'd like to do is invite any of your listeners, Casey, who are interested in doing the official MBTI assessment and having an interpretation meeting. I'm offering that for $99 US, and would just love to explore what the MBTI means for you in your life, and then leave you with some resources to explore it on your own further.
I think that would be really helpful. And thank you for offering that to the listeners. I will put your contact information and how they can get in touch with you in the show notes of this episode. And I think I'm going to have to take advantage of that myself, because Excellent. I know that I've done it at a high level. I have to admit I did it through the internet. So I don't know if I used the right resource, but I'm so interested in this. I don't know if my husband will go for it too, but we'll see. He might.
I have a feeling you're persuasive, Casey.
Oh, you do?
You're a good communicator. It's one of your strengths.
All right. Cool. So anything else you want to touch on? I think this has been so helpful, and I really appreciate you taking the time to come on and to help share with us how this can help women in general life, in work life, as they're quitting drinking, how to understand how to navigate the world so that they don't feel like they need to numb out or have a substance to approach different situations.
Absolutely. And I think, when you're going through a time of change and not wanting to numb out and to learn, it's pretty easy to get down and start focusing on what some of what your limitations are, and maybe some mistakes or some things that you don't like about your personality. And, this is a way to just flip that, get to know yourself, appreciate what your strengths are, learn about how you can turn that into action, and really feel empowered to learn more about yourself. And that'll really help in terms of taking the next steps forward.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Casey.
All right. Bye. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Hello Someday podcast. If you're interested in learning more about me, the work I do, and access free resources and guides to help you build a life you love without alcohol, please visit hellosomedaycoaching.com. And I would be so grateful if you would take a few minutes to rate and review this podcast so that more women can find it and join the conversation about drinking less and living more.